I'm so happy to see you all here. So we have students from my Art and Islam class. We have partners with UTA, the Aga Khan Council for the Central U.S., volunteers, and also members of the Ismaili community, and then many other members who are interested in learning more about Islam around the world. So I'm very excited to have you all here today, and I'm very excited to introduce you to my colleague, Dr. Zulfikar Hirji. So this is part of our Celebration of Islam Through Art conversation series. And after we're done, I'll show you all the full flyer so you can see the rest of the talks. But I'm so happy that we're starting today with Dr. Hirji. So he'll be discussing pluralism and his current research in East Africa, but I do want to introduce him a bit. He is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology at York University in Toronto, and he has many degrees from Oxford, Cambridge, and McGill University. He focuses in his research on Muslim societies in a range of contexts, particularly around the Indian Ocean, and that's what we're going to hear about part of that today, focused on East Africa. And I'm showing you here an image of a book that he edited called Diversity and Pluralism in Islam in 2010. He has many other books and articles that you can find on his website. This book in particular offers some really important perspectives on what pluralism and what diversity means and how it's exemplified within Islam. So I'm so happy to introduce him and to hear what he has to talk about. So I'm going to turn myself off and ask Dr. Hirji to head into the lecture.
So thank you very much, Leah. I hope everybody can hear me. I am going to switch over to a PowerPoint presentation, which will allow you to see some of the things I'm going to be talking about. So I'm just going to do that now, and hopefully that you can see that.
Looks great.
Yep.
Yeah, there you go.
There we go. All right. Thank you, Leah, so much for inviting me today to share my thoughts and research with you. And I'm going to be talking about the subject of approaching Islamic art, or the arts of Muslims, through the lens of pluralism. And I want to just say that it's such a great pleasure for me to be with you again in Arlington, albeit in this virtual medium. And I want to thank all of you for your generosity of time, for joining me today and hearing me out on the central question, I think, of our age in terms of how we think about each other and how we think about this idea of diversity. But before starting, I just want to offer, as a member of York University, acknowledge that York University recognizes the many indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located and that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations, and the area known as Tekaronto has been care taken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat, and it's now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. I want to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and this territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. And I'm speaking to you from the building, actually, that's in the foreground of this picture on the right-hand side of the screen. And unfortunately, it's not that sunny, balmy, clear weather. It's actually -5 and tons of snow. But it's really nice for me to imagine that this is what it's going to be like in Toronto, just outside my doorstep in a few months' time. All right, I wanted to start with this then. So to begin with, I want to share with you my working definition of pluralism, an approach in which human diversity and differences are not only acknowledged and accepted, but are valued to the extent that they're invited in, nurtured, and allowed to flourish. Pluralism is an ethos. Now, this working definition arose during my work on an edited volume, Diversity and Pluralism, that I produced in 2010, a decade or so ago. And since then, I've been thinking about the possibilities of pluralism within academia in terms of curriculum and pedagogy. And more specifically, I've been looking at the Euro-North American academic study of Islam and Muslims more broadly to understand the manner in which this field has been constructed and how it addresses diversity. Now, owing to my own work on Islamic material culture in sub-Saharan Africa and the Indian Ocean, I've started to kind of interrogate the subfields of Islamic art in terms of the manner and which and extent to which the arts and material culture of the region of the Muslim world, this region of the Muslim world has been considered by scholarship. And undertaking a survey of the field of Islamic art, it's kind of become clear to me that the arts of Muslims of sub-Saharan Africa is woefully underrepresented in studies of Islamic art. And in my talk today, I'm going to give you some examples that provide some evidence of this gap and discuss some of the historical reasons as to how this gap in scholarship came to be. And to frame this discussion, I actually want to start with sharing a quote from the Nigerian-born author Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's 2009 TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story. I'm sure some of you have heard this talk. And Adichie reminds us in this talk that, quote, the single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but they are incomplete. They make one story the only story. So when I have been looking at the scholarly study of Islamic art, it became apparent to me that the field of Islamic art has itself produced a single story about the art and material culture of Muslims, particularly in terms of what art matters and where it came from. And the field of Islamic art has unwittingly, therefore, projected a view about which Muslims matter and who is an authentic Muslim. So let me give you some background and examples of what I'm referring to. The field of Islamic art was forged in the image of Western Euro-North American art history, where painting, sculpture, and architecture were seen to be part of the so-called classical, high or fine arts in a kind of linear progression. The fine arts were distinguished from ethnographic objects, and the fine arts were regarded as civilized, and the ethnographic objects related primarily to people identified as primitive. Now, much of the non-Western art, things that fell out of the Western canon of art, was and continues to be interpreted from this perspective. But more troubling, from its inception, Islamic art, constituted as art produced in the Arab lands, including North Africa, Iran, including Central Asia, sometimes Turkey, and to some extent South Asia, scholars used also a dynastic model, often focusing on the arts produced in courts and under royal patronage. And the field of Islamic art reflected a Western colonial gaze and an Orientalist outlook. And this gaze and outlook reinforced ideas of the authentic, original Islam, which resided in the so-called Arab lands and Iran. And this produced and reflected a highly racialized view of art and told us that this was the art that mattered. And this was the art that was regarded as authentically Islamic. Places like Southeast Asia, South Asia, and other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and other parts of the world were completely left out of the study of Islamic art in the formative period of its development. So as a result, there are these huge gaps in the study of Islamic art, and these gaps are also mirrored in collections which are shown in museums and galleries. And some of these gaps are filled oftentimes because people say, oh, we have a gallery of Islamic art, but all our African, Southeast Asian stuff is in galleries related to Southeast Asia and Africa. So there's a big divide in museums and galleries between Islamic arts and those arts produced in other geographical locations. And a lot of those collections in those museums are also termed ethnographic. This is ironic in a certain sense because places like sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia are the places where the vast majority of Muslims live in the world. But these places and the objects that were produced in these places by Muslims are often seen or have been seen to be inauthentic, poor copies, or derivative versions of the much better stuff that was produced in the quote unquote heartlands of Islam. So this is a sort of a reflection of what the current state of the field is. Now, to exemplify my point, I'm showing on the screen a so-called talismanic shirt produced in India during the 15th and early 16th century. The shirt, whose surface is completely decorated with sections from the Quran and contains also the 99 names of God, is believed to be imbued with protective powers and may have been meant to be worn under armor in battle. Now, this shirt is currently in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and is part of their Islamic art collection. Now, on the right-hand side of the screen, you see a different shirt. Now, this is called an initiation shirt from Burkina Faso in West Africa. And it was produced in the early part of the 20th century and is currently held in the Textile Museum of Canada in Toronto. And like the shirt from India, this shirt from West Africa is also inscribed with Quranic verses and other kinds of Quranic material and material relating to Islamic prayer and so on. And it is thought to have also been worn in battle. Now, what's important here in reference to my discussion of how Islamic art has been framed, you would likely and most definitely find the shirt on the left, the shirt from India, which is seen to be from the proper, authentic Islamic world in a museum collection on Islamic art. But the shirt from West Africa and others like it would often be considered to be African art and or ethnographic art. And it would rarely make it into any discussion of Islamic art in a museum space or in scholarship. Now, in 2019, Dr. Ruba Kanan, a colleague of mine, published an article on the West African shirt and showed that its richness and sophistication is exactly the same as the talismanic shirt from India and others from Turkey and elsewhere. But can you imagine, this is the first time that this shirt on the right from West Africa was put into conversation with a talismanic shirt from India. So that goes to show you that such comparisons are only now beginning to be made. And it also shows you that Islamic art has produced a single story about what Islamic art is, and therefore has left out and made incomplete the full range of options and diverse communities that make up the Muslim world. Now, the attitude that I'm trying to convey to you here is epitomized in this quotation by Karen Adel in a article entitled Islamic Art in Sub-Saharan Africa Towards a Definition. And Adel states, how then should the limits for what is Islamic art be set? With the perspective of an art historian dealing with classical Islamic art, note the phrase classical, I find it hard to accept a tribal mask as an Islamic art object in spite of its justification in rituals which have been assimilated into the African Islamic society from pagan practices. So you notice the words classical versus primitive, African versus Islamic. Now, the point that Adel misses is that there was no Islamic art before the 7th century. And the material culture that Muslims have produced since then has always drawn on and was produced within the diverse and rich cultural contexts in which Muslims lived or found themselves. Hence, on the left-hand side of the screen, the Great Mosque of Damascus that was completed in the 8th century. It reflects the Byzantine Christian and Sasanian Persian traditions that had impacted the region. Similarly, the Great Mosque of Jenne in Mali, on the right-hand side, was built sometime in the 13th century, and it reflects the ancient mud brick building traditions of West Africa. Both are Islamic art, and both are influenced by and reflect the aesthetics of their respective contexts. One that is built in the 8th century and one that was built much later on in the 13th century. But when you read Islamic art books or architecture books, you often find a lot of discussion about the Great Mosque of Damascus being one of the earliest surviving mosques in the Muslim world, and very rarely do you actually have any discussion of the Great Mosque of Jenne in Mali, or only a footnote or a small picture saying, oh, and there's Islamic art in this part of the world too, because Muslims live there. So this reflects a real bias in scholarship towards that which is located in the so-called heartlands of the Islamic world and that which is peripheral to the so-called Islamic world. And I'll be discussing the problems with this further in a minute. Now, this perspective is also reflected, as I mentioned, in gallery collections. What you see on the screen is the online description of the new galleries of Islamic art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And if you can read the quotation there, it says, in 2011, after an extensive renovation, the museum opened 15 dramatic new galleries for the art of the Arab lands, Turkey, Iran, Central Asia, and later South Asia. The greatly enlarged and freshly conceived galleries highlight both the diversity and interconnectedness of the numerous cultures represented, with multiple entryways that allow visitors to approach the galleries and art displayed within from different perspectives. Now, that's great. I mean, the Met is one of the world's most famous museum with hundreds and hundreds of objects. But what's missing here from their public statement is anything to do with sub-Saharan Africa. Let me take you also to Toronto, where I am, where there is a new museum called the Aga Khan Museum, a beautiful architectural space which was established in 2014 by His Highness the Aga Khan as part of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture and Development Network, which are keenly interested in Muslim culture. And its description of its permanent gallery states, you can see it on the screen, the Aga Khan Museum presents and collects art from historically significant Muslim civilizations, as well as contemporary Muslim communities and diasporas around the world. The core of its permanent collection, spanning a vast geographic area from Spain and North Africa in the west, across the Middle East to South Asia and China in the east. Again, in the case of the Aga Khan Museum, there is an absenting of sub-Saharan Africa. And this is very curious because the Aga Khan Development Network has a long history in sub-Saharan Africa, and it has done incredible and important work in areas of cultural heritage preservation, education, healthcare, industrial development, and other sectors. But here in the museum's mandate, you see an absence and mention of sub-Saharan Africa as a significant part of its collections. Now, in the case of the British Museum, which is based in London, it was only in 2018 that it established the new Al-Bukhari Foundation Gallery of the Islamic World and installed, for the first time, an Islam in Africa case. And that included objects from the British Museum's ethnographic collection alongside objects from other parts of the Muslim world. Now, the efforts of the British Museum signals a small change in museology and exhibition practice that is beginning slowly to chip away at the presumptions and assumptions that have been made about what Islamic art is and where it can be found. By including sub-Saharan Africa, the British Museum is beginning to break down the stereotypes by telling a different story and expanding its stories to other parts of the Muslim world. But I question why such a change has been so long in the making, and why does it have to be so slow to proceed? Now, after all, historically, one of the first places that the earliest Muslims went to for refuge, owing to their persecution in Mecca, was the Christian kingdom of Aksum in the Horn of Africa. Indeed, Africa was likely to have been the first place outside of Arabia that the verses of the Quran were recited. Furthermore, owing to slavery and trade, Arabia was familiar with and had many African residents, or residents of African origin, including Bilal al-Habashi, whose mother was from Aksum, and Bilal was amongst the earliest of the Prophet Muhammad's followers and the earliest known caller to prayer for the early Muslim community. And of course, Bilal's personhood and life story are seminal to the identity of many African American Muslims. According to the Pew Research Foundation, in 2010, there were some 248 million Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa, and these Muslims lived in more than 41 countries. Indeed, according to the Pew Research Foundation, it estimates that Muslims in sub-Saharan Africa constitute the third largest concentration of Muslims in the world after the Asia Pacific and the Middle East and North Africa. And it estimates that by 2050, sub-Saharan Africa will have the second largest concentration of Muslims in the world. But owing to the centuries of colonialism, slavery, and racialization, nationalist politics, alongside global forms of Islamophobia, the histories of Muslim communities in the region have been lost, submerged, and received very little attention and focus in academia. And as the anthropologist Robert Launay has put it, the field has been constructed as though one cannot be authentically African and authentically Muslim at the same time. And that's a really powerful statement to show you how scholars of this region have found themselves almost as islands. When they speak to Muslims in this region, they find that they themselves feel as if they are the poorer cousins of the real Muslims elsewhere, or that their Islam and their expressions and cultural understandings and social institutions are somehow less than those Muslims who live in other parts of the Muslim world. And scholarship has also seen them this way, and this is the problem that Robert Launay has pointed to. It's more likely to find a study of Muslims in Africa in an African studies journal than it is to find it in an Islamic studies journal. So in 2019, I published an edited volume, Approaches to the Quran in Sub-Saharan Africa, which looked at the ways in which Muslims in the region attend to the Quran, which is, of course, a foundational text for Muslims. And what was striking to me was how scholars have given this subject such little attention, despite the richness of the ways Muslims have attended to the Quran in different parts of the region. So, in the sort of last section of my talk, I want to give you a glimpse of my own research on a corpus of illuminated Quran manuscripts from coastal East Africa in a place called Pate Island in the Lamu archipelago, some of which I published in the Quran volume I showed you earlier. So this is the area that I'm speaking about. This is the Lamu archipelago, and this is a blow up of this area, and you can see it's made up of many small little islands. And by today's standards, this would consider to be a slightly out of the way place, sleepy, a lovely place to go and have a holiday. Of course, there are people there who live and work and crop and farm and travel and do all sorts of things. But it seems like, how can this part of the world, it seemed to me when I came across this corpus of Quran manuscripts, how can this part of the world be so rich in terms of Islamic culture that it's produced? And you only have to look at the small little tiny map that I've got here in the corner to show you that Lamu and the Lamu archipelago is completely interconnected and tied in with the broader world of the Western and Eastern Indian Oceans. In fact, it was historically a major hub, a major port city, a series of port cities that facilitated trade all around this region. Okay? So, and here are two of the places that I do my research in. One is called Siu, which has this fort, and this is Faza, a little town just a little bit north of there, which has this kind of inlet, and this is the small settlement of Faza. Keep that in mind when I'm about to show you some of the art that has been produced in this region. So the Lamu region of coastal East Africa has been home to Islam and Muslims since at least the 8th century, and this is attested to by the archaeological remains of mosques, homes, and graves, and the region has this continuous history of Muslim occupation until the present day. And the people of the region have long been Muslims, but tend to be known by their ethnic name, the Swahili, an Arabic-derived term meaning people of the coast. Now, historically, these coastally located Muslim communities, which were also internally diverse, were at the center of important trade networks facing toward the interior of the African continent and outward toward the Indian Ocean. And they developed a rich and local Islamic culture, drawing from their connections and surroundings, as Muslims have done everywhere. Now, these photographs on the screen were taken in the early 20th century of the leaders of a town called Siu, which I described before, and it was an important center of Islamic learning and cultural production located on the northern part of Pate Island. Now, the people of this region produced remarkable art and architecture, as is exemplified by this fantastic mihrab of the great Mosque of Taqwa, built around the 15th century on Manda Island. This ornately carved door frame dating to the 18th, 19th century from Siu on Pate Island. This inlaid bone throne chair, known as Kiticha Enzi, made in the 19th century on Lamu Island, and this remarkable Quran manuscript, illuminated Quran manuscript produced in Faza on Pate Island in the early decades of the 19th century. And this manuscript and others like it are the subject of my current research. So while these and other examples of art and architecture have been studied by scholars working on the Swahili or on East Africa or the Indian Ocean, they are only now beginning to be put into conversation with objects from other parts of the Muslim world and being introduced more fully into the field of Islamic art. Now, my research on these Qurans aims to situate them in their local context, relating them to their aesthetics of local material culture. So, for example, you can see the stucco surround on this architecture on the house, this house built around the 19th century, and you can see similar kinds of decorative features on the Quran, on the illuminations of this Quran. I also want to connect some of the aesthetics that are found and the calligraphy and the style of calligraphy that you find in these manuscripts to a material culture much farther afield in regions like China. This is an imported enamel vase, cloisonné vase, made in China in the early 18th century. And you can see that here you have what's called Sini Arabic writing, and it is very similar in style to some of the calligraphy on this particular Quran. So what's important is to suggest here that, like Muslims everywhere, the communities of East Africa, coastal East Africa, developed their traditions in conversation with many different traditions. And yet, these communities have been absented from discussions of Islamic art because they have been seen to be peripheral, primitive, not up to par, and so on. But here, as I showed you in examples before, you can see that their art is vibrant, it's rich, it contains all the same components as Muslim communities elsewhere. And so its marginalization is highly problematic. And we can look at some of the reasons why that might be further in the discussion. But it's really worthy of bringing these materials now, with this art and materiality, into full conversation and have it included fully as part of Islamic art studies. So finally, in conclusion, I want to end with some reflections on how we can think about pluralism in terms of Islamic art. I think that such a project is going to require some critical reflection on past practices and the ways that the knowledge of Islam and Muslims has been constructed. I think this requires a very thorough interrogation of the frameworks, terms, concepts, labels, as well as the power structures and institutions that created them. So that means looking at Islamic art's colonial past. It means looking at the ways in which scholars have been sort of stuck in this kind of mentality about what art matters and what Islamic art matters and what Islamic art from which parts of the world mattered. It means actually saying, you know what, there are some problems with your paradigms here and your frameworks, and to rethink that. And that means decolonizing theories, practices, and pedagogies. And it also means voices of diverse stakeholders being part of the conversation. So in my research, I uh, am intending to work closely with local communities who still hold some of these manuscripts and to whom this material culture matters so much. It means telling stories from their perspectives about why this material culture matters to them. It also means talking to experts and others who understand the relationship between these communities and their other connections around the Indian Ocean. It means looking at the materiality of these objects as well, where the paper came from, how the ink was made, what technologies were used to fix the ink onto the paper itself. All of this research hasn't been done, and so you need to really get a sense of how complex these materials were, these art expressions were, to be able to really understand how sophisticated these traditions were. And finally, I think we need to employ pluralistic pedagogies and practices, and that means acknowledging, valuing, and inviting diversity and difference into the room, rather than just simply saying, oh, you're different than me, thank you very much, but actually just saying we want to invite difference into the conversation. But finally, I think as an educator and scholar, I believe that the first and foremost task is going to require what the anthropologist Clifford Geertz has suggested is the central challenge of pluralism, and that is learning to grasp that which we do not necessarily embrace. And with that, I'm going to say thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirji. I wonder if I have a few questions, as you might imagine, but I wonder if any of our guests or any of the students here have questions that they'd like to offer before I have my chance. So I'll give anyone a moment. You can definitely